It was a Sunday morning like any other when I stepped out onto the front porch of my house with a mug of black coffee in hand. The sun had barely crested the horizon, casting golden streaks across the sleepy little neighborhood of Westbridge Hollow. The chirping of birds filled the air, and for a moment everything felt peaceful. But that moment didn't last long. Pinned to my front door with a single strip of HOA branded tape was a piece of paper. I didn't think much of it at first. The HOA here loved printing memos about trash pickup times or reminders about lawn care regulations or barking dog complaints. I had seen it all. But something about this particular notice felt different. My name was typed in bold letters across the top. I took a sip of my coffee and pulled the paper down. My eyes scanned the words once and then again, slower this time, as the meaning hit me like a punch to the gut. Effective immediately, you are in violation of HOA Ordinances 7A, 12C, and 14D. You are hereby given 24 hours to vacate the premises or face legal and financial penalties in accordance with Westbridge Hollow HOA Code. This decision is final. There was no explanation of what I had violated. No mention of what those specific ordinances even were. Just a warning in bold letters at the bottom. Non-compliance will result in mandatory removal. I didn't laugh. I didn't shout. I just folded the paper quietly and walked back inside. My house. My property. My land. And the HOA had just given me 24 hours to move out. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Because I wasn't just a resident of Westbridge Hollow. I owned every inch of land this community stood on. I was the actual landlord. The HOA might have power on paper. But I held the deed. The only reason I'd been quiet all this time was to let them play their little game. But now they'd pushed too far. And it was time to flip the board. Rewind 5 years. I had just returned from a 10-year overseas assignment where I managed luxury real estate development projects for a multinational firm. I'd seen enough corruption and incompetence in those years to last a lifetime. When I came back home, I wanted something quieter, simpler, more personal. That was when the Westbridge Hollow land came up for sale. Back then it was just a stretch of forest and hills on the edge of town. Nobody wanted it. Developers said it was too rugged, too far out, and too expensive to prep. But I saw something different. I saw an opportunity to create something that looked peaceful on the outside but could hide a fortress on the inside. A long-term investment that gave me full control. So I bought it. Every parcel. Every square foot. And when the city council approved the formation of a homeowners association to help regulate the area, I said fine. Let them do it. It would take the management load off me, and if they got out of line I could shut them down whenever I wanted. That's why I never introduced myself to the board. I didn't need their approval. I just bought one of the homes and blended in like any other homeowner. I wanted to observe. To see how they operated when they didn't know the landlord was watching from inside. And at first things were normal. The rules were fair. The board was small. But after 3 years something shifted. New board members came in. People who hadn't read the bylaws. People who were drunk on authority. And most of all, one woman named Brenda Collins, who everyone in the neighborhood had taken to calling HOA Karen behind her back. Brenda was the type of woman who lived to control others. She wore blazers to neighborhood BBQs, carried a clipboard to morning walks, and spent most of her time peeking through her blinds to catch people violating leaf blower regulations. And somehow she'd worked her way up to president of the HOA. That's when things got ugly. Suddenly we had noise curfews, lawn height inspections, trash bin audits. They started issuing fines for things like watering your lawn at the wrong hour or putting your recycling out too early. And anyone who pushed back found themselves targeted. They fined Old Man Dorsey because his American flag was too large. They fined the Johnsons because their teenage son had parked slightly off-center. They fined the Nguyen family 3 times for hosting birthday parties that generated too much cheer. And then they came for me. At first it was small things. A warning about a non-compliant mailbox that I'd had for 3 years. Then a notice about the hedge line being visually disruptive. I ignored most of it. I paid the fines without protest. I stayed under the radar. Until that morning. When I got the eviction notice. 24 hours to move out. I sat down in my living room and laughed for the first time in weeks. Not because it was funny. But because I knew they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The HOA thought I was some powerless homeowner. Some nobody who couldn't fight back. But what they didn't know was that I had the original deed to the entire Westbridge Hollow development sitting in a safe in my office. I had the master contract. The developer's override clause. The emergency dissolution right. All legal. All signed. All mine. They thought I had 24 hours. In reality they had less than 12. That afternoon I went into town and made some calls. I contacted my attorney first. Michelle Burke. A no-nonsense powerhouse who'd helped me navigate international property disputes in countries where bribes were currency and courtrooms were just suggestions. She picked up on the second ring. Hey boss. How's life in the suburbs? They gave me a 24-hour eviction notice, I said. There was a pause. Want me to start the burn notice? Light it up. She chuckled. Say no more. I sent her a scan of the notice and the most recent HOA bylaws. Within the hour she'd identified 3 procedural violations in the way they served the document and 5 more in the ordinances they cited. We had a legal kill switch ready to go. But I wanted to go deeper. I called a second number. Jason Cortez. Private investigator. Former federal contractor. The guy could dig up dirt on a statue if you gave him an hour and a laptop. Jason. I need a full file on the HOA board. Every member. Every background. Every dollar. Just Brenda or the whole crew? Start with Brenda. Go from there. You got it? Give me 2 days. You have 12 hours. He whistled. All right then. It's like that. It's worse. This is personal now. By sunset the neighborhood was buzzing. Brenda was out walking her little dog Muffin and bragging to her neighbor Ruth about how she'd finally gotten rid of the uncooperative loner on Pinecrest Drive. He thought he didn't have to follow the rules, she said loudly enough for me to hear from across the street. Well, not in my neighborhood. If we don't enforce the code, the whole place goes to the dogs. I waved at her. Smiled politely. She looked confused. She hadn't expected me to look so calm. Maybe she thought I was in denial. Maybe she thought the sheriff would be here in the morning with a lock and a chain. What she didn't know was that I'd just called a notary and scheduled a public hearing for the next morning in the community park. What she didn't know was that I'd pulled the original charter and scheduled a vote for emergency restructuring under Article 17B. What she didn't know was that I had filed paperwork to remove the entire board. And what she really didn't know was that I owned the land under her house. The sidewalk she walked on. The road she drove down. And the HOA's office itself. They thought I was powerless. They thought I had 24 hours. But now the clock was ticking for them. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the entire neighborhood had received a flyer on their porch. It was plain white with black ink. Nothing dramatic. Nothing flashy. Just one clear message. Emergency HOA meeting today, 10 a.m. sharp, Community Park Pavilion. Attendance strongly encouraged. No signature. No title. No HOA letterhead. But it spread like wildfire. People whispered about it while watering their lawns. Couples read it over breakfast. Brenda saw it too. She wasn't happy. Not at all. I knew she'd show up anyway. Brenda never passed on a chance to lecture a crowd. But today the stage wasn't hers. This time I was the one who called the meeting. And everything was about to change. I arrived at the park an hour early and stood near the wooden pavilion where we usually held block parties and 4th of July cookouts. I had a briefcase. A foldable table. A single microphone connected to a speaker box. I didn't need much. Just the facts. People started to gather around 9:30. First a few curious folks from the adjacent cul-de-sac. Then a wave of residents from Maple Circle. By 9:50 the crowd had swelled to over 60 people. Most of them carried their copy of the eviction notice I had gotten. Turns out I wasn't the only one who had been targeted. They looked around confused, unsure of who called the meeting. Then they saw me step up to the table and stand behind the mic. Some of them nodded in surprise. Others looked cautious. I could see Brenda pushing her way through the back with a scowl already forming. 10 a.m. struck. I tapped the mic. Good morning, Westbridge, I said calmly. Thanks for showing up on such short notice. I promise this won't be a waste of your time. A few people chuckled. Others whispered. I called this meeting because it's time we all have a real conversation. Not about grass height or trash can placement, but about what's really going on here. Brenda stormed to the front and planted herself next to the table. You have no authority to call this meeting, she snapped. Only the HOA board can summon residents for official matters. I looked right at her. I'm glad you're here, Brenda. This involves you more than anyone. She opened her mouth to protest, but I raised a hand. Please. You'll get your turn. She froze. She wasn't used to being challenged in public. I turned back to the crowd. Some of you already know me. I live on Pinecrest Drive. House number 24. But what you may not know is that 5 years ago I purchased every undeveloped parcel in this community. I still own them. And I own the original master deed for this land. There were gasps, whispers, shock rippling through the group. I'm not just another homeowner, I said. I'm the legal landlord of Westbridge Hollow. Brenda sputtered. That's ridiculous. The HOA owns and manages this neighborhood. I turned to her and smiled. No. The HOA is a governing body created by developer charter. A body that only exists because I allowed it to. A body that has clearly forgotten its place. I opened my briefcase and took out a binder. I held up the original deed. Then the developer's charter. Then the clause I had highlighted the night before. Section 8. Paragraph 3. The original deed holder retains full override authority in all governance matters should the HOA fail to operate in good faith or violate residents' rights. Brenda's face turned pale. And I believe issuing an illegal eviction notice without due process qualifies as a violation. Especially when the target was me. People were stunned. I saw Mrs. Jenkins from Walnut Lane shaking her head slowly. Mr. Pierce from the lakefront properties mouthed the word, "damn," under his breath. But this isn't just about me, I continued. Over the last year this board has issued over 100 fines to residents, held closed-door meetings, ignored appeal requests, and threatened legal action for minor infractions that don't even exist in the charter. I pulled out a stack of copies and handed them to the nearest people in the crowd. Here are the minutes of the last 5 meetings. You'll notice several suspicious items including unexplained fees and discretionary powers granted to the board president without a vote. Someone in the crowd shouted. She fined me $500 because my mailbox was blue. Another added. I got 3 warnings because my son plays guitar in the garage. Then a third voice. They tried to charge me for repainting my fence when I did the work myself. I raised my voice. This ends now. Brenda tried to push forward. You don't have the right to. I held up my hand again. I do. I have the legal override and I filed the paperwork yesterday. Effective immediately I'm placing the Westbridge Hollow HOA under emergency audit. Board operations are suspended. A new election will be held in 7 days. And until then all fines and notices are frozen. A cheer rose from the crowd. Not loud, but real. The kind that comes from people finally feeling heard after months of silence. Brenda looked like she had just swallowed glass. You'll regret this, she said quietly. You think this is over but it's not. I leaned closer. You just tried to evict your own landlord, Brenda. I don't think you understand how badly you've messed up. She stormed off without another word. That night I sat in my office and reviewed the files Jason had sent over. What he found confirmed everything I suspected and more. Brenda wasn't just overzealous. She was dirty. Turns out she'd been quietly funneling HOA funds into a fake landscaping company she claimed was hired for beautification projects. The company didn't exist. The account was a shell. And the money went straight to a card under her name. $12,000. Gone. Worse still, she had modified official HOA records to make it look like the board approved it. But the board never even saw the proposal. And she wasn't alone. The treasurer? Taking kickbacks from a pressure washing contractor. The vice president? Caught trying to rezone his backyard as a business lot to avoid HOA restrictions. It was a house of cards. And it was already falling. The next day Brenda tried to rally her supporters. She went door to door spinning lies. She told people I was an outsider. That I was trying to dismantle the neighborhood. That I had no respect for community traditions. But the truth was already out. By the time she reached the final block, most people had already seen the documents for themselves. They had seen the bank statements, the fake signatures, the checks made out to herself. And one by one her allies began to distance themselves. The vice president resigned. The secretary stopped answering calls. The treasurer deleted his HOA email account. By Wednesday the HOA office was closed. The door locked. The sign gone. I had already hired a temporary operations manager to stabilize the transition. Someone neutral. Someone who understood real community management. And I wasn't stopping there. I filed a full fraud report with the county. I issued reimbursement checks to every resident who had paid illegal fines. And I held a town hall where every resident could speak freely without fear of retaliation. But I wasn't naive. I knew Brenda wasn't going to disappear quietly. She was too proud, too vengeful, and too desperate to admit defeat. Which is why 2 days later I wasn't surprised when I got a letter in the mail. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from Brenda's lawyer. A cease and desist order accusing me of slander, fraud, and unlawful interference. But what she didn't know was that my legal team had already filed counterclaims. And what she didn't expect was that I had recordings of her threatening me. Witnesses. Documents. Contracts. She came at me with a piece of paper. I was coming at her with the law. I held the cease and desist letter in my hand for a long time just staring at it. It wasn't even printed on real legal letterhead. The name of Brenda's lawyer was unfamiliar to me, and when I searched the name online the only listing that came up was a Yelp review calling him the discount attorney of the county. He had a 1-star rating and a blurry picture that looked like it was taken in the back of a gas station. This was the big move Brenda had planned after being exposed in front of the entire neighborhood. She thought a fake threat from a bottom-shelf lawyer would scare me. That alone told me everything I needed to know about how desperate she was. I took the letter and added it to the binder of evidence I had been compiling. By now the binder was thick enough to stop a bullet. Inside were transaction records, misappropriated funds, falsified HOA meeting minutes, recorded phone calls of threats, and even printed emails where Brenda had admitted to forging approvals. But this story was never about one crooked HOA president. It was about what happens when the wrong people are given unchecked power and use it to bully and intimidate anyone who challenges them. And I was going to make sure it all came out in court. The next morning I met with Michelle, my attorney, in person at her office in downtown. She was already ahead of me. She had filed counter-litigation under real estate fraud, embezzlement, and defamation. She tried to intimidate you by pretending the HOA was a corporate authority, Michelle said as she flipped through her own copy of the binder, but you own the land and the founding charter. You could dissolve the HOA completely if you wanted. I shook my head. I don't want to destroy the idea of community. Just the poison in charge of it. Michelle nodded and pushed a document toward me. Then let's start with this. Subpoena the full financial records of the HOA. If there's anything she hasn't handed over, we'll get it through the court. We filed that same day. Within 24 hours Brenda was served. What followed was a week of chaos. The court date was set for 2 weeks out. But before we ever stepped foot inside the courtroom, the neighborhood erupted into full-blown civil war. Brenda began holding secret backyard meetings with her shrinking circle of loyalists. She started posting long rants on the community message board claiming that I had hacked HOA documents, forged my ownership papers, and was working for a foreign real estate firm looking to buy out the neighborhood. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so pathetic. Residents who had once blindly followed her began questioning everything. They dug through old minutes and realized that many of the votes she claimed to have held were never actually conducted. They started talking to each other, comparing finds, finding patterns. It was like a wall of silence had cracked open and a flood of truth poured out. More residents stepped forward with their own stories. One woman had been fined for planting vegetables in her backyard. Another man had been threatened with legal action because his dog barked during the day. A single mother had been ordered to remove a swing set because it was, quote, an eyesore to community values. All of them were afraid to speak before. But not now. Now they had someone on their side. The day of the hearing finally came. It was held in the county courthouse on the east side of town. Not a fancy place. Just a 2-story brick building that smelled like old carpet and stale coffee. But what it lacked in glamour it made up for in importance. I arrived early with Michelle and Jason, my investigator. We had 2 briefcases filled with documentation. Brenda arrived late and alone except for her attorney, who looked like he had slept in his suit. The judge was a tall gray-haired man named Judge Waverly who had no patience for games. The moment he sat down he looked at both parties and said one thing. This is not a soap opera. This is a court of law. If anyone here plans on wasting my time, you can leave now. We stayed. Brenda's lawyer began first. He tried to paint me as a rogue investor who had falsified ownership documents to undermine a functioning HOA. He claimed I had violated codes and bylaws and caused unnecessary disruption to the community. Then Michelle stood up and handed the judge the original deed signed and notarized 5 years ago. She showed the override clause, the charter, the letter I received, and then she dropped the hammer. She handed over the financial records Jason had uncovered showing Brenda's shell company and the payments made from HOA accounts into her name. Brenda's face went white. Her lawyer stuttered. The judge leaned forward and read silently for a minute. Then he looked up and said, "Miss Collins, can you explain why the HOA paid over $12,000 to a company that does not exist for services that were never rendered?" Brenda opened her mouth but no sound came out. Michelle continued without missing a beat. "And Your Honor, the defendant also issued fraudulent fines to multiple residents, fabricated meeting notes, and attempted to unlawfully evict my client from his home under false pretenses while ignoring due process." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of pages turning as the judge reviewed more of the binder. After 10 more minutes he spoke. "I am placing a temporary injunction on all HOA operations pending further investigation. The defendant will relinquish all control and submit to a third-party audit. All fines issued in the past 12 months are suspended and will be reviewed. Further criminal proceedings may be pursued based on the outcome of this case. That was it. Brenda collapsed into her chair like the air had been punched out of her lungs. But I wasn't done. Outside the courthouse, the local news had shown up. Someone from the neighborhood must have tipped them off. A reporter stuck a microphone in my face and asked, "Is it true you're the actual owner of Westbridge Hollow?" I nodded. Yes. And it's time the people living there knew what's really been going on. The news segment aired that night. It showed clips of the court hearing, snippets of the documents, and interviews with several residents who shared their stories. Public opinion turned fast. Within days, more residents filed independent complaints. The county opened a formal investigation into HOA misconduct. And Brenda's name became a punchline at dinner tables and coffee shops all across town. But I stayed focused. This wasn't just about winning a court case. This was about rebuilding something that had been broken. The trust. The neighborhood. The idea that people could live together without fear of harassment or power trips. I scheduled a new election for an interim board. This time every candidate had to be vetted and publicly approved. No closed-door nominations. No secret ballots. We set up a resident council. One representative from each block. All volunteer. All transparent. And I created a fund using my own investment to refund any resident who had been financially hurt by Brenda's administration. The emails started rolling in. Thank you for standing up to them. I thought I was alone. I was going to sell my house until you stepped in. But the one that stuck with me the most was from an elderly couple who had lived here for 20 years. They wrote, "We thought we had no voice anymore. Thank you for giving it back to us." Then came the biggest surprise. Jason called me with a new discovery. Turns out Brenda had been planning to sell her house quietly and move to another state before everything blew up. She had already contacted a buyer. The deal was almost done. But now, with the lawsuit pending and her reputation shattered, the buyer backed out. She was stuck. And guess who ended up buying the property for half its value at public auction? I did. When the paperwork went through, I walked up to Brenda's front door with the final notice in hand. She opened the door slowly. I handed her the document. "This is your official 30-day notice to vacate. The property has been purchased by the owner of the development." That would be me. She stared at the paper for a long time, then looked up at me. "You're a monster," she whispered. "No, Brenda," I said, "I'm your landlord." She slammed the door shut without another word. A week after the court hearing and Brenda's formal eviction notice, the neighborhood was quieter than it had been in years. There were no patrols. No warning letters. No strange inspections or mysterious fines. The clipboard enforcers had vanished. For the first time in a long time, residents walked their dogs with ease, kids rode their bikes past curbs without fear, and neighbors talked to each other without lowering their voices. But behind the scenes, something bigger was unraveling. Brenda had been the face of the HOA's corruption, but as Jason kept digging, it became clear she wasn't the only player involved. She had connections to something much larger. Jason sat across from me one afternoon in my living room, his laptop open and a folder thick with printed emails spread across my coffee table. He looked tired but focused. "You're not going to like this," he said. I leaned forward and asked, "How deep does it go?" Jason tapped a few keys and brought up a spreadsheet. Brenda wasn't just stealing money through fake service contracts. She was part of a network of HOA presidents who shared tactics, resources, and in some cases even legal teams. They operated like a cartel, using templates for fines, coordinating on bylaws, and pushing the same private contractors into their neighborhoods. I stared at the screen. "Are you telling me this was organized?" Jason nodded. "Every HOA in this circle is tied back to one property management company, Rivas Property Solutions. They offer administrative support for HOAs, and in exchange they push their own service providers into the system. Landscaping, plumbing, exterior painting, surveillance, and code enforcement. All of it." He showed me an invoice from Rivas to the Westbridge HOA. It matched one of the fake landscaping bills Brenda had filed. Same formatting. Same vendor ID. Different company name. She changed the company name on paper but used their actual billing system. She was laundering the charges through Rivas while taking her cut on the side. I stood up and paced the room. "And no one noticed?" Jason shook his head. "Not until now. I called Michelle and briefed her on everything. She was already a step ahead. She had submitted a discovery motion to the county court requesting financial audits of every HOA under Rivas Property Solutions. 3 days later, the court approved the motion. Jason and I began compiling a list of communities tied to Rivas. It started with 5, then grew to 15, then 30. Within a week we had mapped over 40 neighborhoods in 3 counties, all showing the same pattern of abuse. Excessive fines, unexplained fees, vendor exclusivity, inflated service contracts. And in every case the HOA presidents were protected by Rivas's legal team. Michelle was furious. They've been operating like a shadow government. Unregulated, unmonitored, and completely insulated from accountability. I asked, "Can we hit them legally?" She smiled for the first time in days. "We can do more than that. We can break them." We held a press conference on a windy Saturday morning. A dozen local residents joined us on the steps of the county administration building. The media came with cameras, microphones, and more questions than we had time to answer. I stood in front of them all and said, "This started with a single letter. A fake eviction notice posted on my door by people who thought they were above the law. What we found was a network of corruption that's been hiding in plain sight for years. This isn't about HOAs. It's about abuse. And it's time we end it." Michelle stepped up and filed a formal class action lawsuit on behalf of the residents from Westbridge and several other neighborhoods. It listed charges of fraud, misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty, and unlawful enrichment. The news exploded. Radio stations ran hourly updates. Online forums lit up with stories from other homeowners who had faced similar bullying. By Monday morning, a group of angry residents in another neighborhood physically removed their HOA president from office and demanded a full audit. The fire was spreading. Brenda was silent through it all. Her house sat empty. The moving trucks had come and gone. No one saw her in public. Her phone number was disconnected. Her former allies refused to even say her name. But Jason wasn't done. He found out Brenda had previously worked at Rivas before becoming HOA president. She had been placed there, groomed for it, given scripts, bylaws, templates, and a monthly bonus for every contractor signed under their umbrella. The eviction notice wasn't just a personal power play. It was a test. They wanted to see if they could force out a property owner without resistance. If it had worked, they would have expanded the tactic. I almost laughed. They picked the wrong guy for a trial run. Jason grinned. They really did. A month passed and the court case moved forward. Rivas responded with their own legal team. 10 attorneys showed up for the first hearing. Michelle walked in alone and still dominated the room. She presented a wall of evidence: invoices, meeting transcripts, text messages, and emails. Everything was laid bare. The judge demanded Rivas freeze all HOA-related accounts and ordered an independent audit by a third-party accounting firm. They tried to stall. They claimed it would take months. Michelle handed over a thumb drive. "It's already done, Your Honor. We ran the numbers ourselves. We're just here to make it official." The judge didn't even blink. "Then let's proceed." Back in Westbridge Hollow, the changes were visible. The new HOA board was made up of volunteers from different streets. Teachers, veterans, nurses, parents, and retirees. People who wanted to help, not control. We rewrote the bylaws from scratch. Simple language. Transparent procedures. Every decision had to be posted publicly. Every fine required a vote. No secret meetings. No unchecked power. We turned the old HOA office into a community center. No more threatening letters. No more clipboards. People who had stopped attending block parties started showing up again. A new park renovation project launched with volunteer labor. Kids painted murals on the old walls. The neighborhood started to feel like a community again. The fear was gone. And in its place came pride. But this wasn't just about Westbridge. Calls began coming in from other counties. Local officials wanted to know what we did and how. Reporters wanted to follow up. Advocacy groups wanted to partner. Michelle proposed launching a coalition. A nonprofit watchdog that would track HOA abuse and provide legal support to homeowners facing unfair treatment. We named it the Neighborhood Justice League. Within the first month we had over 200 members and 5 pro bono attorneys offering their services. People shared horror stories. One woman in Arizona had been fined for drying clothes on her back patio. A man in Texas lost his home over a $10 landscaping fee. A disabled veteran in Georgia had been threatened with jail over a paint color. We couldn't help everyone. But we helped enough to matter. And we were just getting started. Then came the final blow. The state attorney general launched a formal investigation into Rivas Property Solutions. They cited our case as the catalyst. Several former employees came forward with insider testimony. Brenda's name was included in the first wave of indictments. Rivas collapsed within 3 weeks. Their website disappeared. Their offices closed. The phone lines went dead. It was over. I stood in my backyard one evening watching the sun set over Westbridge Hollow. The light spilled over the rooftops, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. I could hear laughter from a barbecue 2 houses down, a dog barking happily, a bicycle bell ringing. This place was mine now. Not in the sense of ownership. In the sense of responsibility. Brenda had tried to use this neighborhood like a weapon. She turned it into a tool of fear and punishment. We turned it into something better. Something stronger. The neighborhood was no longer under siege. It was home. 6 months after the fall of Rivas Property Solutions and the dismantling of the old Westbridge Hollow HOA, the world had changed. Not all at once. Not in some grand explosive way. But in slow, steady waves that started in our little community and spread far beyond it. The coalition we formed, the Neighborhood Justice League, had grown faster than any of us expected. What began with a few concerned residents and volunteer attorneys had turned into a regional force. Over 1,000 members. Dozens of neighborhoods. And most importantly, a unified message. You do not get to control people through fear just because they signed a lease or bought a home behind a gate. We were getting letters now. Hundreds a week. From every part of the country. From people who had been fined for garden gnomes or backyard flags. From single parents threatened with liens over mailbox styles. From war veterans told their service dogs were a violation of visual uniformity codes. From people who had lost homes and dignity to the unchecked authority of HOA boards that operated without transparency or accountability. We were also hearing from lawmakers. One state senator from our district reached out personally. He had seen the coverage of our court case and wanted to meet in person. His name was Marcus Langston. Former city planner turned politician. A quiet man with a sharp mind and a firm handshake. He met me at the new community center in Westbridge one cool October morning. We walked the grounds together. He asked questions. Listened. Took notes. Then he said, I think this can be bigger than one case. I want to introduce legislation to regulate HOA powers statewide. Real oversight. Real transparency. Real protections. I stared at him for a long moment. You're serious? He nodded. I've seen too many stories like yours. This isn't about abolishing HOAs. It's about making sure the wrong people never use them as weapons again. The bill was drafted 3 weeks later. It was called the Community Fairness and Protection Act. It required all HOAs to submit annual financial audits to the state. It banned private contractor kickbacks. It capped fines and required multiple approvals for enforcement. And most importantly, it established an independent ombudsman for homeowners to appeal to when boards acted unfairly. We testified in front of the state committee. Michelle presented the legal angle. Jason explained the investigation process. I told our story in plain words. What started with a piece of paper taped to my door had become a movement to protect millions. The bill passed with overwhelming support. 2 months later it became law. And with that law came change. HOAs across the state scrambled to update their procedures. Some voluntarily disbanded. Others restructured completely. Residents who had never spoken up before were now demanding votes on board decisions. And the fear that once ruled entire neighborhoods was replaced by something stronger. Voice. We expanded the Neighborhood Justice League to 5 states. We launched a hotline. We held training workshops for residents on their rights. We published a free legal guide for dealing with HOAs. And every time someone stood up to a board that overstepped its bounds, we shared their story. We turned fear into fuel. And every victory was one more brick laid in the foundation of something real. Brenda was never seen in public again. She never returned to Westbridge. Her name faded from headlines but not from legal records. The charges stuck. She paid heavy fines and lost her ability to serve on any HOA board or property company ever again. Some said she moved to a small town on the coast. Others claimed she changed her name. I didn't care. Her story had already ended. Ours was still being written. On the 1-year anniversary of that eviction notice, I stood on the front porch of my home with a new cup of coffee. Just like before. The sun was rising slowly over the neighborhood and I could hear the laughter of kids riding scooters down the sidewalk. A dog barked once. Leaves rustled gently in the wind. And for the first time in a long time I felt something I had almost forgotten. Not because I had won, but because the people had. This was never about revenge. It was about reminding those who forget that power must answer to the people. That neighborhoods belong to the people who live in them, not the ones who manage paperwork. That community is not created through threats or citations but through connection. Later that day I walked to the old HOA office. It was now the public library. Run by volunteers and funded through donations. Inside I saw kids reading on bean bags and a retired teacher leading a writing workshop for seniors. It was more than a building now. It was a symbol of what we chose to become, of how far we came. I passed by a corkboard where someone had pinned old flyers from the past year. Right at the top was a photo of the original eviction notice that started everything. Someone had drawn a big red line through it with a note underneath in black marker. "This is what happens when you mess with the wrong landlord." I smiled, then walked outside, because my job here was done, and it was time to help the next neighborhood take back their voice. Thanks for watching. If you've ever dealt with HOA drama, or just love seeing justice served, make sure to like, subscribe, and join the fight against HOA corruption. Right here on HOA Confidential. More unbelievable stories coming soon.